Great. Okay, I think we are ready to start. Um, Ramadan Kareem, everyone, and so happy to welcome you to this third session of our Social Reproduction Theory Lab. And thank you for all of you tuning in from various parts of the globe. I recognize some of you from um, Latin America, some from India, and of course, some from the US. And I hope you will be part of what I hope will be a very, very stimulating conversation today. Um, Before I introduce our wonderful speaker, I would just like to remind you that this series is part of the Social Reproduction Theory Lab, very generously being sponsored by the History Department at Purdue University. My co-collaborators on this project are Vipanchika Shahasri Pagyanagar, a graduate student at the Department of History working on colonial prisons, Dr. Susan Ferguson, and Dr. Aaron Jaffe. I hope you will look at the recordings of the previous sessions that are now on YouTube. I would also like to highlight that Susan Ferguson and I are completing a manuscript right now under contract with Pluto Press about a life making and, more importantly, death making in Palestine. And we have some brilliant contributors, many of them from Gaza, who are contributing to this volume. So please review the new catalog on Pluto Press because they already have the book up. Speaking of Pluto, I also would like to highlight that Sue and I run a book series through Pluto Press called the Social Reproduction Theory book series. So we have some wonderful texts already printed and some really brilliant ones in the pipeline. So if you have a manuscript, or you know of someone who has a manuscript, we would love to hear from you. This lab was started as an effort to centralize and collaborate on different conversations on SRT, or social reproduction theory. We really want to emphasize that we would like to be in conversation with people who do not fully agree with us, who completely agree with us, and who are uncertain about whether they agree with us. So we want to engage an entire range of ideas and understandings of social reproduction theory, because it is more important in this day and age for us to be on the same side of the barricade rather than be on the same side of a particularly intricate theoretical position. So that said, it is my great pleasure to welcome today's speaker, Professor Premilla Nadasen, who is a professor of history and gender and sexuality studies at Barnard College in New York. Professor Nadasen has published extensively, and I mean extensively, on the multiple meanings of feminism, alternative labor movements, and grassroots community organizing, and is most interested in visions of social change and the ways in which poor and working class women of color fought for and fight for social justice. Her latest book, Care, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, is a very, very important contribution to this debate, where Premilla basically unravels any kind of romantic visions or NGO visions of care and tries to show its relationship to the much more careless and anti-care institutions of capitalist power. Premilla is a dear, dear colleague and has been at the forefront of the recent struggles against apartheid, Israeli apartheid, and for justice for Palestine. Please join me in welcoming Professor Premilla Nadasen. Premilla, take it away.
Thank you so much, Tithi, for that warm welcome and introduction. And I also want to thank Sue and Aaron, the three of you, for inviting me to participate in this conversation series, and to Vipanchika for all your work in taking care of the logistics and the behind the scenes organizing. I actually just want to begin by acknowledging this very tumultuous moment we are living in, especially those of us in the United States, although there are clearly repercussions around the world. There is a global realignment, dismantling of the public sector, a brazen corporate takeover of the reins of government, clearly a form of proto-fascism that's emerging, if not fascism itself. And alongside this is the ferocious attack on higher education, free expression, and organizing. The students, faculty, and staff at Barnard College, where I teach, and Columbia University are experiencing an unprecedented retribution and repression. I'm sure many of you have heard about one student who just a few days ago was abducted by ICE agents. He is a green card holder who was living in university housing. And he was coming home from a dinner with his wife on Saturday evening when he was accosted and taken into custody and then removed from the state and his whereabouts. We suspect we know where he is. We think we know where he is, but we have not gotten confirmation of that yet. ICE agents have also attempted to detain another student, but was prevented from doing so. Our campus is currently crawling with federal officials in student housing and faculty housing and trying to get onto the campus itself. And I say that because I think it's a particularly difficult moment, and I think more than ever we need solidarity, radical critique, and organizing. And so I appreciate this conversation very much for that reason, and I do think that part of getting to a place of real solidarity is also very honest critique and disagreement. So I am going to say some things that might differ a little bit with some of the people who are joining us today. I also just want to thank all of the folks who are listening today for being here. I want to begin with a bit of background about my scholarly and political trajectory, which has its roots in organizing. I started organizing around apartheid and racism, South African apartheid and racism, when I was in high school at the age of 17. I continued when I went to college, and I came to believe that I could deepen my knowledge of history and social change by reading and theorizing and becoming a professor. But my point of origin was activism. And this early history informed my academic career. I write about labor, race, gender organizing, and social reproduction, and I'm simultaneously involved in grassroots organizing and community collaborations, both on campus and off campus. So for me, there are multiple synergies between organizing and theorizing. My writing speaks to those constituencies that I write about. But in addition to that, the experiences, actions, and ideas of workers, organizers, poor people, and women of color inform my theorizing. This, I think, raises questions about what is theory and how we name it. I come from a study of history rooted in a perspective of racial capitalism that draws on the day-to-day experiences of ordinary people to craft theory. In an insightful essay about racial capitalism, the historian Walter Johnson argues that in order to understand the relationship between slavery and capitalism, we should follow Cedric Robinson, the one of the most important, perhaps the most important theorist of racial capitalism, to ask not what Marx says about slavery, but what slavery says about Marx. So I believe it's imperative that we consider the historical specificity of social reproduction, domestic work, and the care economy. Social reproduction and its relationship to capitalism is not static, and we must examine the shifts and evolution in their historical context. In my scholarly work, I have grappled with paid, unpaid, underpaid, unrecognized labor in the household and its relationship to family life, the labor market, and resistance. My first book on the welfare rights movement was about how poor Black women in the 1960s and 70s organized for state assistance to support their work as mothers. My second monograph was about household worker organizing in the post-World War II period. So, in both of these books, I argue that with the decline of manufacturing in the US, organizing inside and outside the household by nurses, teachers, domestic workers, mothers, restaurant workers, hospitality workers are new pathways for organizing that have become the face of the labor movement. So, my arguments in these books align very much with social reproduction theorists who argue that social reproduction has been the basis of worker struggles and a site of political possibility. So, I really want to hold that up as a very important contribution. More recently, in Care, the higher stage of capitalism, the book that was just mentioned, it draws on my earlier research and writing to examine care work, the care economy, and its relationship to capitalism. And I just want to say, as a caveat, I use the term care, even though I find it very problematic. And I've written elsewhere about that. I also mention it in the book as well. But I use care in part because of the audience that I'm speaking to, people who don't understand the term social reproduction and for whom it would be much too complicated to explain what that means. But I'm happy to talk more about that terminology in our discussion. In Care, I draw on the voices of grassroots activists, welfare recipients, frontline care workers, and people in need of care to decipher their understanding of the care economy. What Cindy Katz, the geographer, calls the messy, fleshy components of social reproduction. In developing this argument, I draw on theories of racial capitalism, which Robin D.G. Kelley defines as his understanding of racial capitalism is that, I'm going to quote him here, capitalism is always racialized and gendered because it extracts wealth and structures value by assigning differential value to human life and labor. I also rely on the theoretical frameworks offered by radical Black feminists such as Claudia Jones, Esther Cooper Jackson, and Angela Davis. A perspective of racial capitalism situates the care economy in a longer historical frame and challenges much of the conventional thinking that has emerged from the scholarship on care and social reproduction. So racial capitalism for me is not simply including workers of color in our already formed and created theories of social reproduction, but is in fact thinking about how we can revise our theory of social reproduction based on the analysis and the experiences of not only workers of color, but people of color more broadly. So in Care, I consider social reproduction not only as a precondition for capitalist profit, but as a source of capitalist profit. In this way, I differ from social reproduction theories that rest on a presumed tension between life-making and profit accumulation. They understand capital's reliance on social reproduction for the production of labor power, which then produces profit through commodity production. Social reproduction, in this view, is a necessary precondition for capitalist profit, but not a source of it. The cost of social reproduction is a drain on capitalist profit, which capital aims to minimize. Strategies to reduce the cost of social reproduction by lowering wages and dismantling the welfare state, they argue, has resulted in a crisis of care. The recent expansion of the care economy, however, has shown, as well as the history of the care economy, I would say, has shown not a contradiction between capitalism and care, but an alignment. If capital generates profit from social reproduction, then there is no inherent tension between social reproduction and capital accumulation. If we shift our analytical focus to women of color, it becomes clear that profit has always been extracted from the lives of Black, Indigenous, and Brown people. Their reproductive capacities have been used for the production of labor power and is simultaneously a source of capitalist extraction. So part of what I'm suggesting is that social reproduction's contribution to capitalism is not only the regeneration of labor power, but the reproduction and the maintenance of people. Social reproduction vis-a-vis capital and the state cannot be analyzed without considering the bodies, especially the racialized bodies, that were being reproduced. That is, how some people's labor was deemed more valuable than other people's labor, and how some people were deemed more valuable than others. Manufacturing still generates profit, so I don't want to discount the manufacturing sector. And there still is a need to produce labor power, particularly in the global South, where a great deal of manufacturing has shifted. Indeed, the vibrant consumer economy of rich countries that runs parallel to and feeds off the care economy would not be possible without a manufacturing sector. So there's always been an overlap between, what I think of the phases of capitalism. If we think of industrial capitalism, finance capitalism, to what I call a care economy now, there's always overlap and no clear distinctions there. I think the care economy is also deeply intertwined with the financial sector. But in addition to this, I argue that the state has been a central actor in fueling the care economy and has itself become a site of capital accumulation, exacerbating economic inequality. So employing this historically grounded Black feminist approach, I'm going to talk very briefly about profit extraction from social reproduction in the context of slavery and contemporary capitalism. The care economy and the state's complicity in treating people as commodities has a long history in racial capitalism. The reproductive capacities of Black and Brown people have been used for the production of labor power and has been a source of capitalist extraction. And the example of slavery, perhaps, I think best illustrates this. An entire industry emerged around enslaving and transporting people as commodities. Financiers, insurance companies, shipping companies benefited financially from the trade in enslaved people and the presumed capital in human bodies. Profit accrued from the slave trade illustrates that people were both commodities and were treated as commodities and produced commodities. With the end of the transatlantic slave trade in the early 19th century, as historian Jennifer Morgan argues, slave owners encouraged or coerced enslaved women's natural reproduction for the purpose of selling enslaved people. In this way, the labor of social reproduction that enslaved people engaged in for their own families, their life-making or their care work, contributed directly to capitalist profit, not just labor power. Dana Ramey Berry, in her book, Price for a Pound of Flesh, demonstrates the extensiveness of the commodification of Black bodies from womb to grave, how even the cadavers of deceased Black people were sold or stolen for medical science, which she calls ghost value. The process of attempting to turn people into commodities involved an incomplete, imperfect, and always fraught process. Stephanie Smallwood has argued that, quote, turning people into slaves entailed more than the completion of a market transaction. In addition, the economic exchange had to transform independent beings into human commodities, whose most socially relevant feature was their exchangeability. Slavery, then, is an example of how capitalism was never only about production and the exploitation of labor, but about the reproduction and sale of human bodies as commodities. Even after the abolition of slavery, Black and brown people were rarely given the opportunity to produce life. They were excluded from the welfare programs and labor protections, denied equal access to veterans, housing, and Social Security benefits, and entangled with the carceral system, which destroyed family life. The moves towards greater access coincided with economic restructuring and dismantling of social programs. So Black and brown people rarely had state or capital support for social reproduction, even when their labor was necessary. Capitalist extraction from life did not end with abolition, as is evidenced with the rise of the care economy. And I think one important distinction that is in the care economy, capital's interest is not exchangeability, but extraction of profit from life making, the stuff that enables us to live day to day, to ensure we are fed and cared for. The shift to a care economy began to accelerate in the 1970s. Because of neoliberal restructuring and the middle class crisis of care, care as the site of capital accumulation became a hallmark of the US economy, and I would argue is one of its defining features today. With middle class women's entry into the labor force, the decline of full-time homemaking, and the diminishing state services and support, families increasingly turn to the marketplace to meet their needs. The diffuse and decentralized nature of the care economy means that there are many layers of profit to be made. Capital accrues from the money that people spend on healthcare, education, childcare. A growing number of corporate firms managing home health care, backup, childcare, dog walkers, and food delivery are now dedicated to meeting social reproductive needs. The number of people involved in what we would call paid social reproductive labor has expanded considerably, far outpacing manufacturing. Today, fewer than 10% of American workers are employed in manufacturing. Care.com, I want to see how I'm doing on time here. I am going to skip a little bit so we have more time for discussion. Care.com, world's largest online destination for care, is one example of a company that has grown exponentially because of the care crisis. But the care economy is defined not only in terms of commodification or subsumption of social reproduction, or on the reliance on the market required to sustain life, but on how sustaining life itself becomes profitable. Okay. And so we only have to look at, for example, the for-profit nursing homes or hospice care, for-profit hospice care, to see that that is the case. It is sustaining life. It is not just the childcare that we need in order to go to work and how that has become commodified. And I think for me, that's a very important distinction. Alongside this, the outsourcing of public sector services and administration has been a boon for private companies, and this is the role of the state in particular. How does state spending lead to profit? There's a transfer of state funds in multiple ways. States rely on certain programs, particularly programs targeted for the poor, to either balance its budget or to fund other programs. So we see a transfer of funds from some programs into other programs. There's a state handing out of contracts to for-profit companies or nonprofit companies, but that's still part of the private sector. And I would argue there is capital accumulation even in the nonprofit sector. State actors are also hiring or putting on payroll individuals who they know. That could be friends. There's an example of a case in Mississippi where the director of the Department of Health and Human Services, in fact, put friends on payrolls to develop apps and to do all sorts of things, to give lectures. Um, so one quick example, I'm going to cut this a little bit too. Maximus is one of the largest health and human services contractors with local, state, and federal governments, and its backstory is tied very much to the demise of the welfare state. So Maximus runs state health insurance exchanges, welfare to work programs, child support enforcement, job training. These are all state-based programs. Maximus's approach to child welfare is the one I want to talk about, which is particularly egregious. It helps state child welfare agencies reduce costs and maximize revenue. One way the company brings economic efficiency to foster care is to garnish the benefits of children who are entitled to disability or Social Security payments because their parents have died. And it examines personal health and school records and caseworker notes to determine if a child could be deemed emotionally or physically disabled and qualify for assistance. Maximus describes foster children, as Professor Daniel Hatcher writes in 2016. They describe them as, quote, a revenue generating mechanism. So decisions about whether children should be taken into state custody or remain with their families are determined in part by the company's revenue goals, which Hatcher writes are not aimed at determining how best to meet the child's needs, but rather at how to best use the child to meet the fiscal needs of the agency and the state. In the winter of 2020, Maximus had $3.7 billion worth of state contracts in New York alone. It benefits from the poverty and hardship and treats people as products. So the crisis of social reproduction, everything from poverty to foster care to child care, has proven to be an opportunity for economic growth. Under neoliberalism, the scale and pace of extraction from life itself accelerated, and reproduction now exceeds manufacturing as a source of capital accumulation. Of the top 10 Fortune 500 companies defined by revenue, today, 4 are part of the care economy. By contrast, in 1980, the top 10 included 6 oil and gas companies, 2 tech firms, and 2 auto manufacturers. Companies are eagerly seeking out new ways to profit from care. This includes a company that was founded by Melissa French Gates called Pivotal Inventors that has produced both an investor's guide and an entrepreneur's guide to the care economy. Such financial advice suggests that there's a growing market for care and that social reproduction is a source of capital accumulation for corporations, nonprofits, the states, and individual households. The way human survival has become a means for capitalist growth in deindustrializing countries is shocking and grotesque. Economic instability, household debt, and labor precarity are all feeding on and thriving in the care economy. Under neoliberal racial capitalism, the care for bodies with vulnerabilities and incapacities has become a source of wealth, whether those bodies are in jail cells, immigration detention centers, nursing homes, or daycare centers. People who might otherwise have been deemed unproductive or a surplus population and cannot contribute to capital accumulation through their labor power may contribute through their need for food, shelter, health care, and mobility assistance. And our love for them impels us to consume services and buy products to ensure that they are cared for. And in the process, we deepen our relationship with the care industry and further exacerbate social inequities. Capitalism has always caused pain, whether the displacement of people for the purposes of extractive mining, environmental destruction, or the pain and suffering associated with the exploitation of colonial labor. But under free market neoliberal policies, investment in people as profit has expanded and accelerated. In this new stage of capitalism, the care economy parasitically feeds off pain, where some people's pain translates into other people's profit. Neoliberalism strategy vis-a-vis social reproduction is not only about cost cutting, but is a crude resorting of differential values of humans and how profit can be extracted through that sorting mechanism. And so my argument in the end is not only about social reproduction and how it has evolved over the years, but is also about the shifting nature of capitalism and capitalist profit. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Premilla, for that wonderful, rich, and thoughtful presentation. It was stunning, and I hope a lot of people have things to say. I just want to add one tiny thing to your splendid argument. I volunteer at the Rape Crisis Center here, and every 2 or 3 years, we have to fight for federal and state funding because uh, the funding is more concentrated on how well we, or not me, I'm just a volunteer, how well the center coordinates with the police and the Justice Department rather than funding which is without any kind of strings, right? So even when the state does give funding for care, it tries to integrate that care into the anti-care or carceral sector. So I just wanted to add that. And this is a fight we've been having for over 2 decades, that I have been volunteering here every 2 or 3 years. So it's just disgraceful. So, okay, I'll stop and open the floor to questions and comments on Pramila's wonderful talk. If you'd like to speak, either raise your hand or put a comment in the chat and I will just read it out. Go ahead, Sue.
Yeah, so thanks so much. And it's interesting because listening to you, I think what I keep feeling is there may be disagreements in terminology in some ways, but not so much in the logic, I think. Because I do think certainly the way in which I think this is true of Tithi and Aaron and others who have written sort of within this social reproductive theory framework, think about care work and the care economy is that it is one incredibly important aspect of value production too, for the very reasons that you say. I won't go on for much more about that, but I am curious because this is where I think the terminology issue rears its head for me a little bit. Is for me there's a distinction between profit and revenue, and so I think that comes from a fairly, orthodox, I guess, Marxist understanding of what produces value and what produces profit. And so I just wondered if you could expand a little bit on that for me, because when I hear you, one of the things that I keep thinking is like, okay, so if a state-run system, well, here's maybe a concrete question for it. If you have a state-run retirement home or senior care home versus a private run senior care home, the value that is produced there, I would say, is different. Well, the value is being produced, I would say, in the services from the workers in the private sector home, but I wouldn't call it profit that's being generated in the state-run home for various reasons. But I'm just wondering, perhaps you do, and so knowing that or understanding that would help clarify it for me. At least that's I'll just leave it at that for now. But there's lots, I think, of lots more that can be discussed. Thanks so much for your.
Yeah, thank you for that question, Sue, and it's a really important one. And I would say that that model of a state-run elder care facility is no longer the norm for the state. I mean, that was the model for the state in the 1960s and the 1950s when we actually had a robust welfare state. But in fact, so much of the state today, the neoliberal state, there are very few state-run agencies. And so almost everything is outsourced. And so I think that part of my analysis comes from understanding the convergence of state and capital. There's always, we know there's the state and capital have always had similar interests. There's always been overlap there, but there has been something of a distinction, and we've understood that distinction. My first two books were very much, we're critical of the welfare state, but also we're invested with this possibility of, what can be achieved by leveraging the state. I think we're in a very different moment right now, and not just Trump. I think we were a very different moment before Trump came into office because the nature of the state is fundamentally different today than it was 30, 40, 50 years ago. So yes, I think it's profit. I think what we're seeing is profit extraction from state spending in multiple ways. You're muted, TT.
If you'd like to speak or contribute in any manner, please raise your hand or put your comment in the chat and I will read it out. Aaron. No, I'm sorry. Somebody has a hand raised.
I think it's Anna Maria.
Sorry. Anna.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the presentation. I don't know if it's very clear, my question, but I was wondering, I read a couple of chapters from your book, and I also recently read the article by Alisa Battistoni on rethinking reproduction. And it seemed to me that from like with different literatures, but and I was wondering about this, that you were going in the same direction in a certain way of de-exceptionalizing to a certain extent care work or social reproduction work, and pushing more towards thinking about social reproduction work, like the way she does it, it's away from the wages for housework, but more towards the service sector. And I was wondering if that's like if in like rethinking about care work, it's like more pertinent to think about the service sector, which is like employs like mainly people who are poor, who are like people of color, migrants. And I remember that in her argument, the way she like she was argue she the way she was arguing about why the care economy might be different than the other economy, and that's why I think, from the way I understand it, there might be a disagreement between you two, is the fact that she argues that I think she bases, when she thinks about the service economy, she was working with the work of an economist, and about how the care economy has a technology problem, in the sense that in the other part of the economy, you can always have technological advancement, so you can always increase profit because of that. And these economists seem to argue that the limit in profit making of the care economy is that you cannot.
Can you sum up, please, and let Premilla answer? Yeah.
No, so sorry, yeah. I don't know, if that's clear.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think I write a little bit about this in my other book, Household Workers Unite, where I talk. I do not believe that care work is exceptional. I think there's a lot of work we can put in that category of what we might call some people have used the term intimate labor. There's all kinds of ways to think about it. I think thinking about it as exceptional work is rooted in understanding about the emotional investment in the labor, which I argue we should not think about it in terms of an emotional investment, but rather simply as labor. And that's what organizers in the 1960s and 70s argued, is that this is labor. And I don't think we can expect it. I mean, there are teachers that are being replaced, but with computer models, and people believe that that was never possible before. So I think that I think technology right now is pushing the limits of what we believe can be commodified in ways that we never imagined before. So will care work be commodified? I think it's very possible. I don't know. I don't know for certain. But I do think that care work is not exceptional. I do think that we need to think about it as part of the broader service sector. I think the concept of it being exceptional is often rooted in its association with unpaid labor in the home. And I try to de-link those two.
Thank you. We have a question from Pyle Rai here, Ray. The domestic care work is not generally reciprocated either economically or emotionally, but it's a labor that one cannot thrive without. What are your thoughts on this, and how do you think such care labor can challenge the preconceived notions of care ethics?
I guess I'd like to ask them what they mean by it's generally not reciprocated. I mean, and I guess why care work? I mean, when we go to see a doctor and they examine us and presumably care about us, it's not reciprocated either. I don't think any labor is reciprocated. Do we expect care work to be reciprocated? Are we talking about paid? I mean, I assume we're talking about paid domestic care work. So I guess I would like a little bit more clarity on the question.
Can I go ahead?
Yes, of course.
Yeah, so what I meant was that if you see the works of our mothers and daughters who are giving cares to elderly or the newborn child or their children, their caregiving works are generally kind of like given they would work, they would provide care to others. So like that self-negating caregiving model that is based on mostly how others would benefit from their labor. So that kind of labor I'm talking about, care labor.
Paid or unpaid?
Unpaid.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. I think the question of unpaid labor is to me, a different category from paid labor. And I think those are often conflated. I think we have to think about them very distinctly. I think there is a lot of unpaid labor that takes place in the household. Some of that can be very good and very nourishing and uplifting and community building. And some of that is very exploitative and gendered and racialized. And that is a reflection of the inequalities we see in society more broadly and pay scales more broadly, the kind of work that's valued more broadly. So I think we need different collective models of how unpaid labor is organized. I think on a communal level. I mean, ideally, we need to move in that direction. Um, I mean, in an ideal world, and in my last chapter of my book, I talk about this. I don't think we're ever going to live in a world without care work. That's a part of our life, and care work should not feel exploitative, even if it does sometimes. We should do it because we want to. I was with my father this weekend, actually a couple days ago, taking care of him. And I was there because I wanted to be there, because I wanted to see him, because I wanted to help him. Not everybody is in that position and not everyone can do that. But ideally, that's where we need to be, where we do work and we care for other people out of desire and joy and pleasure and our commitment to community. But we're not there yet. So I think we still have a long way to go.
Thank you. Dipsita? Dipsita? You're muted. Did you have something to add, Dipsita?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
First of all, I want to thank everyone. It was a really enriching discussion. I just had 2 points to make, actually one and a half. I think you were told that there are paid social reproduction workers, like people who are in delivery workers, people who are, say, part of the wellness programs like Urban Company, etc. So we are recently working on a paper where we are looking into these gig workers, women gig workers primarily, how they are becoming a part of a care network where they're giving food to people, where they're taking care of people, giving them massages, spas, and etc., different kind of beauty treatments. But during that process, the kind of labor or the kind of care work they used to do for their own family, particularly taking care of their children, etc., somehow they have to compromise it. Somehow they have to negotiate the time between the care work they do inside their home and the care work that do professionally. So can you think of something, a framework that we can discuss on, something around the labor and leisure, something around how the care workers themselves are, what you told, that they have been denied of producing their own life. So can we have and it's not a question exactly, I'm just like thinking through while I was listening to you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, that's a really great question. I don't know that I have an answer for that. I will just say there are historical models out there, models such as the wages for housework movement, which was a very important kind of historical example of women who were burdened with household labor, who demanded wages and support from the state for that work. And I think the core question is, why is it that workers are paid a wage to take care of other people's children, to provide services for other people, but are not paid a wage to take care of their own children? So
Mhm.
you can be hired to take care of someone else's children, and you then need to hire someone to take care of your own children, right? And so there's a lack of value associated with the unpaid labor that people do in their own homes for their own families. Most of the historical examples of that have centered on state-based demands, the wages for housework movement, the welfare rights movement in the United States, which also demanded state assistance for poor mothers to be able to take care of their own children. So I think that, I mean, the question I have is about the state and how do we engage with the state at this moment? And the state is, rapidly disintegrating before us. And I don't know what's going to be left of the state in a few years, but I think this question of how we engage with the state is one that people on the left will have to grapple with.
And by state, you obviously mean the welfare part of the state, because the carceral part of the state is ever present and growing every day. So,
Yes.
yeah, just
Yes.
just to clarify, that's what I think Premilla means. Um, so we have a wonderful another comment and question from Haiza in Rio. Professor Nadasen, thank you very much for your amazing contribution. Your arguments speak directly to our daily struggles. Sorry, my cat is going insane. To our daily struggles here in Brazil. And I would say that this changes in the nature of the state sounds very much how it is historically in countries that didn't pass through the welfare state, which the relation of capital state private public should be seen as an exception and not as a norm, in my humble opinion. I'm just curious to know, what are your thoughts on dependent countries' periphery of capitalism in relation to care economy? Do you see any distinctions regarding central capitalism now? Also wanted to thank you for the political importance of your work. It's especially important in terms of clarifying the distinction between neoliberal state care policies that are now being built by NGOs in Brazil and Colombia, for example, to our demand for life making and what we call here as the access to the bem viver. So that's
Yeah.
from Haiza.
Yeah. Yes. I will say that a limitation of my study is that it is US based, and I don't claim to make arguments about any other parts of the world, although we know the U.S. economy is deeply intertwined with global processes everywhere. So you cannot study the U.S. without studying other parts of the world as well. In terms of, I think you are absolutely right that in other parts of the world, there wasn't the same kind of robust welfare state or seemingly robust welfare state that seemed to define mid-20th century U.S. history. So they essentially skipped over that. Some of my thinking about other parts of the world is I'm from South Africa. I spent a lot of time there, and sort of seeing state capture, seeing state corruption there. I was there for an extended period of time a few years ago, actually when I was finishing this book, and so that made me think a lot about the state and the role of the state in non-Western countries and how our presumed commitment or investment in state policies doesn't always work the way we would like them to work. And I think especially in the case of South Africa, which there was an amazing political movement around a democratic state with a lot of hopes for a country that was relatively resource rich, and to see that the national resources essentially being stolen, continue to be stolen, was a real tragedy. But I just very much agree with your point about non-Western countries and the kinds of daily struggles that people are dealing with.
Thank you. This is from Marcela Orozco. Professor Nadasen, thank you for sharing your ideas with us. Could you talk a little more about environmental destruction within the perspective you presented?
Yeah, I think that environmental destruction, I think care work is very tied up in environmental destruction, and we've seen crises in various parts of the world in the country where the narrative has been about how care work in these moments of environmental crises is when we need care workers the most, and care workers will come in above and beyond and care for us. And so it's been framed as a need to revalue and recognize care work. But in fact, I think what environmental destruction has done, whether we're talking about floods or wildfires or rising sea levels or hurricanes, or freezing cold temperatures, is that in fact that sorting mechanism that I was talking about is even more exacerbated, right? There is a hierarchy of life that defines everything, that defines how state programs are identified, who benefits from them, who doesn't benefit from, whose homes get destroyed, whose homes get rebuilt, who gets insurance, who doesn't get insurance. So I think the questions that I'm raising about hierarchy of life that structure the care industry also, again, the care industry is so intertwined with environmental destruction that we see the same patterns there.
Thank you. This was in full display during the awful LA fires. Everybody's homes got scorched, and I'm not undermining the homes and memories of famous rich Hollywood actors. However, the famous rich Hollywood actors can afford to rebuild without insurance. Whereas, the mobile homes that got destroyed or smaller homes that got destroyed, that is a lifetime gone, up in smoke. So, Ian Tien, thank you for this amazing talk. I feel there are two levels of social reproduction happening. One that is social reproduction as governmental responsibility and tasks with social reproductive characteristics in our life that might be called life making or desire to care out of our commitment. Do you think these two are separate, or if not, how do we think of them in our analysis, both in totality and in its specificity?
Well, I think the state and the market, state and corporations overlap. And I think we're seeing that more than ever right now. So I would not make a clear distinction between government responsibility for social reproduction, right, and the ways in which we rely on the market for care responsibilities. If we think about something simple like food stamps in the United States, right, SNAP, people are given debit cards, right, which they then use in a supermarket, right? Or if we think about housing vouchers or school vouchers, the state today is moving in a direction of being even more intertwined, bolstering and supporting the market. So I don't believe that those two are separate. There are very few examples of of government responsibility for social reproduction as we might have understood it. Schools still exist, but public schools have been defunded, as we know. And more people are turning to private schools or are using vouchers, city vouchers, state vouchers, to send their kids to private school. So that's a very quick answer to your question. I hope that was sufficient.
Thank you. Aaron has a question on crisis.
Oh, thanks so much for your talk. This is really, really enriching, and I feel like so on point at so many different levels. And I think I might just be asking maybe a request for a bit more information. I hope it's not just a semantic worry, but I'm wondering if you could say more about your notion of crisis, because especially the notion of crisis of care. It seems like a lot of the analysis you've provided suggests that it's not so much a crisis as an opportunity for the continued growth of capital. And so I'm wondering if what crisis means is that there's like a real rupture in the system, right? It just cannot go on the way it's going on anymore. It seems to me like you're showing that it indeed can and increasingly will go on much in the same way that it's going on now. So maybe the notion of crisis is that there's a tension or a problem or not the right kind of values being articulated. But from a Marxist notion of crisis, like it just can't continue working in the way that it is. It seems like maybe the analysis runs against at least that understanding of the concept.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's absolutely right, Aaron. I don't believe that capitalism is in crisis. I think capitalism is in perpetual crisis, but I think capitalism is always trying to find new ways to resolve that crisis. And so I think with has there been a crisis in social reproduction? For families, yes. For communities, yes. There is a real crisis that ordinary people are facing right now. That crisis, I believe, has become a source of economic opportunity and growth for capital. Was that pre-planned? I don't think so. But I think it has become that. It has become a source of profit. It has become, in my view, the new stage of capitalism. And, will it continue to grow? I don't know. I'm a historian. I look back, I don't look forward. I don't predict the future. I don't know what's going to happen with this. But I do think at this moment there is clear evidence to me about how capital is benefiting from what we understand as a crisis of ordinary families and communities and people.
I have another comment from Heisa, but if somebody else, a first-time speaker, would like to go, I'm happy to take that too. Or I'll just read Heisa's comment. Something we are trying to understand here in this new stage is how the castle stage is expanding through its militias, that since slavery was never just private for controlling the means of subsistence of the working class against big capitalist corporations, but assuming their markets in Black and working class neighborhoods with a higher expansion of militarization, territorial occupation, and genocidal violence, of course. Maybe this is another face of how the higher stage is sounding in the global South, while all that you've been describing is also happening.
Yeah. Thank you for clarifying that and helping me answer that question. I think that I see care and carcerality intersecting in multiple ways. One is, I think, what was a move towards decarceration, for many years, especially by the abolitionist movement in the US, but also in other parts of the world, uh, led to, I believe, other forms of care systems that were also profit oriented, right? So when we look at the agencies that were funded by the state for job placement, when we look at the kinds of I'm sorry, the name is escaping me, the trackers that people had to wear when they're on parole, right? Those are all privatized and those are all profit making. So I think the shift from carcerality to care still means a certain kind of control, a certain kind of social control, of mobility control that sits alongside profit making. Right, that's one thing. I think the other thing is how we think about who is cared for and who is not cared for, the sorting mechanism that I mentioned. And I think we're seeing this so vividly right now in the Trump administration, and your example of Brazil is also incredibly powerful. And that is, how does care for some people mean containment, incarceration, deportation for other people? And all of these immigration facilities that Trump is currently sending people to are largely for-profit centers. There is a booming industry around companies that are running institutions of containment. And so I think there is both those people who are being contained and profit that are or being released from containment and the profit that's associated with that. And then there is the way that care for some people is premised upon incarceration and control or deportation of other people.
Thank you. I have a question since there's no others right now. Just before I ask it of Premilla, I just had a thought for Dipsita when you asked a question about work and leisure. I mean, just following Premilla's presentation, it's also worthwhile to remember that leisure under capitalism is also never pure leisure. So the time that you have for leisure or the kind of ways that you can be at leisure is also determined by how much time work demands of you. So that's kind of the relationship is more dialectical than there's work time and there's leisure time. So leisure time or temporality is also shaped by work time. So just to kind of keep that in mind. For Pramila, especially because of how you answered the last question. My question is, how would you, and this is something I've been thinking about, how would you theorize abolition and social reproduction theory?
Abolition of the carceral state.
Or abolition theory.
Can you define abolition theory for me?
Yes, abolition theory or abolitionism would be that we are not taking away prisons or we're not taking away armies. We are putting in place institutions of care and institutions of community service that actually replaces those ideas, those institutions of force and violence. So not just, prisons should be abolished, but it is related to. So how would you kind of theorize that?
Absolutely. So I think that I would actually ask the question of what do we mean by carcerality? Right? And do we understand carcerality only in terms of the institution of the prison? Or do we also understand carcerality in terms of state institutions? And the legal scholar Dorothy Roberts has written about the child welfare program, which she calls the family policing system, right, as a form of carcerality. So if we understand carcerality in that way, I very much believe in abolition and I believe in abolishing even those quote unquote care systems that serve police functions or policing functions, right? And moving towards a truly emancipatory, collective, liberatory model, not just of restorative justice, but also of care.
Mhm. 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 And even Columbia University, or all our universities, are part of the carceral model right now. So, yeah, very much so. All right. We are nearing the end of our time, and I want to leave some time for Pramila to add some last thoughts. So, I will take one last question or comment if you have any. Go ahead, Sue.
Yeah, thanks. This has been a really interesting discussion. I just wonder maybe this can prompt your final thoughts, from the question of transition and change, and where care workers fit in that, in your understanding of how we might one day eventually get out of this awful situation that we're in. If
Yeah.
and if they have a special role to play or not. Yeah.
I think they do. I mean, a lot of my writing and a lot of my political work is in conjunction with people who are really at the forefront of what we would call the care economy. And I will just give one example. There's a group in New York here that I do a lot of work with called the Damayan Migrant Workers Association, a Filipino organization made up largely of labor trafficking survivors, many of whom are in the care industry. And Damayan has been around for over 20 years, and their model of organizing, I think, is one that both that combines both day-to-day care, meeting people's needs where they are. So during the pandemic, they were handing out care packages to people. They were creating housing space or finding housing space for people who were fired, who were live-in workers. They have advocated for TPS legal status for care workers who have lost their jobs or have been victims of labor trafficking. They are also working towards long-term transformative, anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist uh, forms of social change. And I think that's really hard to find in a lot of grassroots organizing today. Um, so I think that yes, the short answer to your question is absolutely. I think care workers, it's not the only site of organizing, and I really want to stress that because I think all the work that is happening, and there's all forms of resistance. There's resistance around Palestine right now to defend higher education. I fundamentally believe that grassroots organizing is the only way to defeat authoritarianism, is the only way to defeat carcerality, is the only way to transform the care economy. It is not going to happen from the top down. It is not going to happen because we get Trump out of office and we elect someone else. That grassroots organizing is paving the way to social change. And whether it's, the work of the folks who are, I think a lot from what I've heard from the questions, a lot of people on this call are involved in that organizing. And I just want to say thank you for the work you're doing because that's what matters more than anything else. So I think whether you are involved, working with waste pickers, whether you're working with domestic workers, whether you're working with teachers, whether you're in a union or not in a union, I think mobilizing people and creating political and economic alternatives is really the way forward. You're muted, Tithi.
How amazing. What an amazing note to end on. Okay. All right, Premilla. Thank you so much again. And very, very good luck and full solidarity for all the challenges and battles you have ahead of you in Columbia and Bernard. And I know I can speak for everyone on this call that we all wish you the very best because an injury to one is an injury to all. So we stand with you, absolutely. comrades, our next speaker is on April 16th, Srisha Naidu, and she is at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. And I hope you will also join me on that talk. And now, shall we say thank you again to Premilla and say goodbye?
Thank you.